Welcome everyone who joined, and welcome to the SHISMD webinar, No Coding Required, Kickstarting Your Accessibility Journey. SHISMD would like to extend a sincere thank you to Reason One for sponsoring today's webinar. Now before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, this webinar is now being recorded and is broadcast in listen-only mode. We welcome your comments and questions throughout this presentation. Click the chat icon in the lower right-hand side of your screen to enter your questions or comments, as we have allotted time at the end for Q&A. Please select all panelists to direct your questions to the speaker. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Ann Mayer, who is Senior Content Strategist at Reason One, a B Corp digital agency based out of Toronto and Charleston that specializes in clients in healthcare and other nonprofit sectors. She has more than 20 years of experience in the digital world, specializing in website and mobile app content planning, creation, and governance. She brings together expertise in editorial best practices, information architecture, marketing, content management, and digital user experience, and has a particular passion for accessibility. And with that, Anne, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Tom. And thank you to SHISMD for having me here. I'm excited to talk to you about accessibility. Whether you are in Marcom, digital strategy, or business development, or some other role, I'm hoping that my topic today will resonate with you and that you'll have some sort of takeaways. As members of an organization that supports diversity, equity, and inclusion, you're probably aware that your digital strategy should include making your content accessible for people with disabilities. In fact, healthcare organizations in the US are mandated by the ADA, the Americans with Disability Acts, to provide full and equal access for people with disabilities. In reality, fewer organizations are fully there yet. Some of you might just be starting out on your accessibility journey. Whether you're just starting to think about digital accessibility, or if you're looking for some tips to improve, or maybe you need to convince resistant stakeholders to invest in it. This talk is for everyone. So as I've pointed out in my title, there is no coding required. So what do we mean by accessibility? There's lots of definitions floating around, but in short, it's about ensuring that your websites, apps, and other digital properties are useful to and usable by everyone, including people with disabilities. So you can see how accessibility is actually part of something much larger. This probably sounds like a tall order. We're not going to have time today to, of course, get into the specific solutions. What we're going to be doing is taking a step back and looking at how you can create the mindset that leads to accessibility being adopted as an integral part of your digital strategy, and how you can make accessibility part of your overall DE&I efforts by developing a culture of inclusion. So there will be a lot of sort of theory and philosophy, but particularly for the hands-on marketing communication folks, I am going to give you some few takeaway tips that you can easily implement into your digital content right away. So let's start with accessibility and why it's important. Do you know what this number represents? 30%. If anybody knows, they can put it in the chat. If not, I'll tell you that a stat that you may have heard that gets quoted a lot is that 1 in 5 North Americans has some sort of permanent disability, which is roughly 20%. But if you factor in temporary disabilities, it's actually 30% of users at any given time who are disabled. And think about that from a healthcare lens. Potentially 30% of your site visitors can't access important healthcare information. 30% of your patients might not be able to book an appointment online or sign up for a clinical trial. 30% of your patients might not be able to access their own healthcare records online unless they get another person to look it up for them, which of course is a violation of privacy. Um, 30% is a lot. Accessibility for people with disabilities has until recently been thought of as its own thing. But as I mentioned, it's really part of the broader category of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll be showing a little bit more about that in a minute. But it's actually taken us a while to just get to this basic understanding of accessibility. Many of the first attempts to include people with disabilities online didn't even count as accessibility. Was typically efforts to accommodate people with disabilities. It was about making special accommodations for the differently abled. For example, you still sometimes see statements such as, if you can't read this, contact us and we'll send you a Braille or large print copy. Which of course begs the question, how did they even get that information? Um, but more importantly, accommodation is not accessibility. Making someone take a special action because they're different and emphasizing their otherness is not the same thing as making a website accessible. Remember that accommodation is not accessibility. Thankfully, we've mostly moved beyond mere accommodation, and we're now broadening the scope even more, not just focusing on people with disabilities. We're now talking about accessibility for everybody. So you'll hear a lot about universal or inclusive design, and that's really where DEI comes into play when you're thinking very, very broadly beyond just people with disabilities. In recent years, the definition of disability itself has evolved from an implied deficit in a person to an emphasis on the barriers that an individual faces. The World Health Organization now defines disability as a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features in society. It's not about the person, it's about the interaction between the person and their environment. So, in other words, people are only disabled because they face barriers in their environment. If you take away the barriers, they're not disabled. And this definition also acknowledges that society plays a part in creating the disability. So, think about it like this. Instead of saying someone is wheelchair bound, we now say that they're a person who uses a wheelchair. There's a difference. The wheelchair doesn't define their identity. When our buildings have steps but no ramps, a person who uses a wheelchair is disabled. When we put up a barrier, they're disabled. When there is a ramp or a clear pathway, they're not disabled. They can get to the same places as those who can walk. So we need to look at the barriers that we are creating, including with our digital properties. So who's facing barriers with our websites? Disabilities can be permanent, temporary, and situational. It's important to remember that these types of impairments can look very similar when applied through the digital user experience. So that's why we say like at least 30% of users um, are disabled at any given time. Um, so here are some common disabilities. This list covers disabilities that we commonly think of, such as blindness and deafness, mobility issues such as paralysis or tremors, amputation. But there are also disabilities you might not think about, the so-called silent disabilities such as spectrum disorders, dyslexia, attention deficit, seizure disorders. This list even includes things like language barriers in noisy environments, problems using small mobile devices or old technology or limited bandwidth. Those are the things we talk about when we're talking about situational disabilities. Um, did you know that fully 90% of non-disabled users have trouble using mobile devices, either occasionally or frequently. And then, of course, there's aging that creates a complex mix of many of these. Um, and bringing it back to DEI for a second, notice that some of these also overlap with economic issues. So when we're thinking about equity and inclusion, think about those who don't have access to the latest technology or high-speed internet. So who is accessibility for? It's for all of us. We are all temporarily abled. People who understand this tend to become accessibility champions. And if we're all temporarily abled, it's also true that making things better for people with disabilities makes them better for everyone. The good news is that instead of trying to solve for umpteen different types of disabilities, which is a daunting thought, we just need to create one clear path for everyone. And that's how inclusive design covers all the bases. Apart from being the right thing to do, accessibility has a huge return on investment. There's a lot of available research that shows that accessible products and services, as I said, improve usability for everybody, not just people with disabilities, increases audience reach and share, creates more engagement opportunities, increases customer loyalty, improves SEO. There's actually several areas where accessibility and search engine optimization overlap. Um, improves mobile usability. Studies also show that without accessibility, you're not just losing people with disabilities as customers. You're also often losing their family and friends out of loyalty. So let's take a look at where we are collectively and how well we've been doing to remove barriers. Okay, here's another number. Um, anybody know the significance of this? It's actually a date. No? This is when the first website accessibility guidelines were published, 1996. That's a long time ago. But accessibility has actually been talked about even several years before that, um, probably going back to at least 1990. So if you are just now hearing about accessibility or just now considering implementing it, you're way behind the curve. So we can look at a quick timeline here. So the website actually began mostly as the internet began as really just email, but the first website was built by Tim Berners-Lee in December 1990. So um, that was the first website. Um, and then over time, so by 1994, a gathering of um, website specialists got together in this international consortium, and that's when they started talking about issues on the website and how they could create standards that were consistent around the world. So by 1996, a group of those folks in the W3C consortium spun off a special web accessibility initiative, the WAI, to specifically focus on standardizing accessibility guidelines. Um, and the WAI is still one of the major accessibility organizations. Um, so they created something called the Unified Website Accessibility Guidelines, which eventually morphed into the WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. 1999, it was version 1. We are now into version 2.1 and 2.2, and they're working on a 3.0. So you can see the evolution right from really 1990. Accessibility has been in the forefront, and the solutions to make websites accessible have been there that whole time. So it's been a known issue for decades. And the solutions have been there for decades in these guidelines. So let's look at where we are now. 96.8%. Does anybody want to guess what this number represents? It's not a success metric. The WebAIM organization does an annual review of the world's top 1 million websites. In 2022, 96.8% of homepages had detected WCAG version 2 failures. 96.8%. Now, homepages are the front doors to your sites. So if your homepage isn't accessible, your whole site won't be. And note that they say detected failures. Those are just the failures that can be captured by automated testing. Usually manual testing uncovers additional problems that automated testing doesn't find. So in 1994, Tim Berners-Lee, who's basically the godfather of the internet, told this consortium of web developers that we don't want to lose this feeling that the web is totally accessible to everybody. And clearly, 96.8% of homepages had detected WCAG 2 failures. We failed his vision pretty hard. So let's look at how we got here. We take a look at some of the reasons why sites aren't accessible. You may have heard some of these in your own organization. So here's a list of things that we've heard often. 1, what's accessibility? They've never even heard of it. We don't need it. Usually because they think their sites are fine. We don't have to do it. That's usually said in the legal sense. We don't. It's too ugly or too basic or dumbed down if it's an accessible site. It's too expensive to do. It's too time consuming to do. It's too hard. So let's look at each of these. First, lack of awareness. Often people just don't think about accessibility because they've never needed it themselves. Take the example of a broken elevator. If you're able-bodied, it's annoying, but you might think, okay, I'll just take the stairs. I need the exercise anyway. It's not a problem until you break your leg and need crutches and need to carry your groceries up 4 flights of stairs on crutches. And I don't know if you recognize this image, but the characters on The Big Bang Theory spent 12 seasons ignoring their broken elevator because it didn't matter to them. Organizations have been ignoring their website's brokenness since the 1990s, often because they just don't think about it. Some folks abandon attempts at accessibility after being overwhelmed by the technical jargon. There's so many acronyms and abbreviations and numbers. It's just too much. So they wait until the lawyers tell them that they have to do it. So I'm not going to get into too much detail about what these things are, but you may have heard of some of them. And I've mentioned ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. That's a civil rights law that prohibits discrimination for people with disabilities. Section 508 is part of the Rehabilitation Act, federal law that applies to U.S. government websites mainly, but anything to do with communication and technology. WCAG, the Web Content Guidelines we've seen. WCAG also, each of the guidelines is divided into single A, double A, and triple A, depending on the level of complexity. If something is single A, it's an absolute must-have. Without it, your site won't be accessible at all. Double A, most things will be accessible, and then triple A is the highest level, and that's usually resolved. AAA is usually resolved for the really complex things that most sites probably aren't adding to their site. And don't worry, there isn't going to be a test on all of these things. This is just to give you a little bit of background. But there's a relationship between ADA and Section 508 and WCAG. For example, ADA does not point directly to WCAG. The WCAG are the guidelines on how you can meet guidelines. Section 508 specifically calls out WCAG, 2.0 AA or higher. So if you fall under Section 508, you have to meet WCAG. ADA does not explicitly call out WCAG. However, WCAG is increasingly being used as guiding principles for lawsuits. So you can be sued for not being accessible. And lawsuits for noncompliance are increasing drastically, and usually the plaintiffs win. So WCAG, very important, but we're actually not really going to be talking a lot about WCAG. The main thing that I want to stress today is just understanding the context in which all of this is working. So this is actually, this slide has, this is what the guideline looks like. And you can see it's a very formal document. And it is very overwhelming, particularly if you don't have any sort of accessibility background. It is a huge and complex beast, and it's a very useful one, but it's overwhelming if you're not familiar with its structure or any sort of general principles. In general, your development team is going to need to know the technical details of how to build an accessible site. So they will be using this document. And it's a pretty cool document in that you can dig down into it and get the exact code that you need to fix your problems. And that's why the guidelines are there. It creates uniformity and creates solutions. But here's the thing, non-developers don't need this document to understand the basics of accessibility. And so that's really what I want to talk to you about today. If you're interested, you can look this up, but you don't have to. Designed for humans, not a checklist. So understand that accessibility is a human issue. So understand who it's for and why. Understand the challenges that others are facing and the part that you play in creating or removing barriers. And once you have that baseline understanding, it makes it a lot easier to learn the how. And the technical guidelines will then make more sense. Another misconception is the belief that you'll lose creativity or the cool bells and whistles if you introduce accessibility. And this isn't true. The best designers know that it's possible to create things that are both useful and beautiful. And a few things to remember. First, accessibility guidelines, as I showed you, have developed along with the tech advances. So it's absolutely possible to create impressive, modern, yet still accessible sites. Another thing that's really important is that operating systems and web browsers already have all the accessibility features that we need. It's built in. Our role is not about adding accessibility features. It's about getting out of the way and making sure that our websites work with the features that are already available. And another point that I find really interesting is that many of the technologies that are commonplace now actually began as accessibility features. Things such as Siri and haptic alerts, like the vibrations on your phone or watch. They all started as accessibility features. So you can actually be ahead of the curve if you're looking to accessibility developments. That other excuse that we hear, it's not in the budget. First of all, if you think that it's too expensive, you care more about your profits than about your clients, or in your case, patients. And tip, you're actually losing customers. And two, if you think it's too expensive, you're doing it wrong. When implemented correctly, it's not more expensive than ignoring the problem, particularly if you're risking lawsuits. It's only hard and costly when you try to patch things up at the end of the process or after launching the website. Retrofitting it after the fact is how the accessibility is difficult mentality developed. It's always easier, faster, and cheaper to start with accessibility from the beginning. So bake it in at the earliest planning and design stages of your process. This quote captures it in a nutshell. Accessibility isn't something that you can add in at the end. It's not the icing on a cake. It's the eggs that make the cake. The most valuable thing you can do is to create a culture of accessibility at your organization, a culture where inclusivity is so ingrained in everyone's thinking that it's effortless. And to get to an inclusive mindset, you need to encourage empathy. Empathy, as you all know, is the ability to understand others' experiences vicariously. There's a lot of talk about empathy these days, or the lack of it, both in business and in the current political climate. Studies have shown that empathy in the workplace, studies have looked at empathy in the workplace and have noted that it creates a better employee experience and better business performance. There's more collaboration, more productivity, less stress, lower turnover. So there's benefits far beyond your accessibility goal if you encourage an empathetic culture. Um, with the exception of a small percentage of the population who are psychopaths, people are hardwired for empathy. And as important, empathy is a skill that can be developed. So, what are some ways that we can develop empathy, particularly regarding accessibility? First of all, empathy begins with awareness. Remember that elevator. Um, I recently took an informal poll of my coworkers and asked them about their experiences learning about accessibility. And I asked, what was it like when you first learned about accessibility? And there was a common theme with several people saying a variation on the same thing. They said, it just didn't occur to me before, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. That's empathy in action. I also saw this very recently on Twitter when a blind user asked folks to please don't bog down their Twitter handles with a lot of emojis because it slows down the screen reading experience. So blind users use screen reading technology to read out content, and it also reads out all the extra little bits of code that might give you some clues to what's going on. For images, such as emojis, they hear the name that defines the emoji. Um, so you would get something like, you know, and Mayor, Canadian flag, happy face, happy face, happy face, happy face, happy face. Not a great experience if they have to experience that every single time they're scanning through Twitter. But what happened was once this woman pointed it out, so many people responded with, "Oh my God, I didn't realize. Thanks for telling us. I'm going to change it right now." And like literally dozens of people said that. There's one or two trolls who said, "No, I'm keeping my emojis." But really, like 99.9% of people were grateful to learn about it and were happy to change what they were doing. So that is empathy in action. Um, so to use an ableist metaphor, once you see the world through someone else's eyes, your worldview changes. So try to get your teams to start seeing the world from another's perspective. Start by introducing your teams to the concept of accessibility at a high level. Break down resistance by debunking those myths that we just looked at in the excuses, and show them the challenges that people face. So get your teams to become aware of some of their ableist biases. Does your product development or marketing team, for example, assume that everyone has an email address or that everyone has a phone number? I have a friend who's deaf who doesn't, and he gets really annoyed when he can't submit forms or register for something because there's a mandatory phone number field and no other option. Do you assume that everybody has good cell reception with large data plans and fast internets? Are you assuming that you have no customers in remote communities? Do you assume that everybody has the latest smartphone? Your teams don't mean to deliberately exclude people, they just don't think about it. But once you point it out, most of them will remember and be more conscious of this. So here are some more things that you can do with your teams um, to get them to use their imagination to develop empathy. So take these common tasks, searching for something on a website, navigating to a particular page on the website, watching a video, paying a bill online. These are probably some all things that your own sites have. Now use your imagination. Set aside some time and try this with a group. Um, it's really good to see people's reactions. It's frustrating and also eye-opening. Turn off the sound on a video. How much information are you getting? Unplug your mouse. Can you find the information you're looking for or perform tasks with just a keyboard? Keyboard access only is really important for accessibility because um, a lot of people can't use mice. Um, the blind and visually impaired using screen readers, they can't see where a mouse is going. They just use a keyboard to tab through content. But also folks who have tremors, for example, can't use a mouse. So there's lots of people who rely on keyboard only. Try it yourself and see how far you get. Um, Try turning off your screen entirely. Can you do anything? You tend to hear a lot of, oh yeah, now I get it. Um, there are accessible solutions to all of these barriers, and they're all in WCAG. You can, but I'm not going to talk about those. The point here is to just start by recognizing them. So, whoops, ah, sorry, my apologies. Where was I? Jumped ahead. Right, there we go. So you've got your team thinking about accessibility. What else can you do? So I'm a content strategist, so I can't not talk about content. Content is the very reason that people come to your site. The internet is a means of communication. And so, of course, it's nothing if you're not communicating well. One very easy and inexpensive way to improve your digital properties is to edit your content so it's more accessible. And no coding required. And as a bonus, you will improve your SEO. There's a lot of focus when you hear about accessibility on coding and on design. Not a lot of people actually talk about content accessibility, which is why I'm going to talk about a few tips for you today. Um, Content writers are also particularly adept at picking up on accessibility principles because the first rule of writing is know your audience. They're actually very good at empathy. This is a list of some of the worst offenders as reported by people with disabilities. Most of these are not developer things. You can see that some of them, like font size, relying only on color, some of them are designer things. The ones that I've highlighted here are things under control of an editor. And again, no coding is necessary for these. Um, so uh, video and audio that's missing transcripts. This is a big problem, and transcripts are mandatory for videos. You might want to take a look at your own sites to see if you've got transcripts right now. Transcripts are just straight text files. If you can use MS Word or Notepad, you can create a transcript. Cluttered page and walls of words. There's too much copy. We've all seen these pages, and they're very annoying. Editing the content to reduce wordiness, adding subheads to break up the text to make it easier to scan. Very easy to do. Layout and navigation are a problem when zooming. Often, again, this is caused by too much text and not having those subhead landmarks. A writer can improve how understandable and easy to use your site is with the right words, in the right place, in the right amount. One of the most effective things that you can do is to follow plain language principles for your content. The writers among you might already be familiar with this. Plain language principles include things like short sentences, straightforward grammar, the use of active versus passive voice when possible. The active voice simplifies grammar and reduces cognitive load. One instruction per sentence. The use of simple everyday words and elimination of jargon. This is particularly important in the healthcare center because you might not even be aware of how much jargon you use. This is where you really want to think about what is your end user using, not what do you use internally as an organization. Um, the use of bullet points when appropriate, and writing at a grade 8 reading level or lower, using standard readability guidelines. In English, the most commonly known one is something called the Flesch-Kincaid scale, and I'll be talking about this in a second. But there are other scoring systems. But you can literally analyze your copy and see what grade you're writing at. Here is an example of a plain language technique, turning something into bullet points. So it's the same content, just presented differently. So on the left, you have a really wordy paragraph. On the right, you have the same content turned into bullet points with the unnecessary words removed. And you can see right away that it's much shorter. It's easier to scan. It's easier to remember if you're listening to it. If it's formatting correctly, most screen readers used by the visually impaired will also let the reader know, the listener know, to expect a list and tell them how many items are in the list, which really makes it easy to keep track and to more easily remember the items in the list. I often hear pushback about the grade 8 part. It's important to remember that plain language is not dumbing down. It's clear and straightforward. It's somewhat closer to how we speak naturally, but it's not quite as informal. And chances are you won't even notice anything unusual about content written at the grade 8 level, other than it's easy to understand. I often hear, but our readers are more sophisticated and they expect more complex language. That is not true. There are some great meta studies that have shown that the more educated an audience, the more they appreciate plain language. They are usually professionals, they're busy, and they want you to get to the point. They also recognize when you're trying too hard to sound smart. If you want to read more about this, I've just put up the name of a couple of studies by Professor Christopher R. Trudeau. And his studies, he did a meta study called The Public Speaks, and then a follow-up called The Public Speaks Again. And there are some really interesting observations in those. So recommend checking those out. The plain language movement actually began in the legal profession by lawyers who understood that the language that they were using was causing all kinds of problems with understanding and creating risk. And in healthcare, the American Medical Association has for some time now advocated for plain language in healthcare, and not just for people with disabilities. They've recently made it part of their racial justice and equity efforts, acknowledging that historically their language has disadvantaged large segments of the population. And the CDC and NIH make similar statements. So plain language has many advantages. It's easy to understand, both when reading and listening. Um, for the visually impaired, it's also easy for screen reading technology to pronounce words correctly. It reduces risk by reducing ambiguity and misunderstanding. It's efficient. It helps the widest audience understand your message and helps all users find what they're looking for quickly. Again, thinking of your healthcare clients when they're under stress and they're looking for important medical information, you want to make sure they can get to it quickly. Less content also means better load speeds for your sites. So it's actually even environmentally friendly and a better user experience for loading the site. It helps with globalization. So plain language is easier to understand by people who speak English as a second language, for example. It's also easier to translate without errors. Because it's generally shorter, content fits more easily on mobile devices. And it's important for internal and external search, including voice search, because it's using a language that your audience actually uses in these tasks. And I mentioned before, it improves SEO for that same reason. It's using the language that people actually use. And it even helps you present a more friendly and approachable brand. So win-win-win for using plain language. Something else to remember, that it's easy to develop sites that rely too much on visuals to convey meaning. We are a visually biased culture. Remember that not everyone is reading the content on your page. Many are listening to it with screen readers. So it's important how your content sounds. And this is something that you can all do as content creators. Strip out all of the pictures, the visual layouts, and any graphic elements. And what's left is what a blind or visually impaired user has to work with. So you can literally scrape your content into a Word doc and read it out loud. Listen to it and ask, is there enough content? Is there too much? Is it in the right order? Is it easy to understand? Can I remember it? Can I act on it? Something else that everybody can do right away, there's a good chance that you're posting images on your social media accounts. And those images on their own aren't accessible to blind users. Um, all images that convey meaning need alt text or alternative text. They're descriptions of the image. Um, and all the social media platforms have built-in capability for adding alt text. So get into the habit of adding descriptions to your images. Here's just some example. You've got Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and sort of Mastodon, which is a new one that everybody is moving towards. You want to leave Twitter. Um, but there, it's all there right away. So just get into the habit even with your personal accounts. So you know what accessibility is, and you have some tips to start. What next? You want to normalize it. Normalize accessibility at your organization so that everybody considers it. Start by finding the champions at your organization, those who already know something about accessibility or who want to learn. Um, Another thing that researchers have found is that empathy is contagious. So start with the champions. Here's some things that we do at Reason One to normalize accessibility. So it's at the forefront of everybody's mind. We have a dedicated accessibility Slack channel where anybody can pop in and ask questions, or I've got a problem, how do I solution this? We have some great discussions. People post things that they've found. We have an informal working group that meets regularly over Zoom. Again, anybody can drop in on a chat. It's not just for the working group. We host lunch and learns. We have a wiki that has a ton of resources and tools. The whole company participates in Global Accessibility Awareness Day, which is usually in May. And we have activities throughout the day that people can do when it fits their schedule, and everybody participates in fun activities, like our GAD bingo. So we switch up the tasks every year, but these are fun, easy, informative activities, from watching theme videos to playing games to practicing things like writing alt text. And it's a great way to keep accessibility at the forefront. And notice none of these require coding. This is stuff that everybody at the organization can do. So remember to design for humans, not a checklist. As this image says, accessibility culture eats WCAG compliance for breakfast. It's about the culture. You don't need to have technical knowledge to contribute to accessibility. It comes down to your organizational culture. And that culture starts with you, whatever your role. Particularly if you're in a position of leadership, tone at the top trickles down. So inclusive leadership is vital. Um, Start with empathy, though, and accessibility for everyone will follow. So thank you. I don't know if anyone has any questions. You can put it in the chat.
Just a reminder, yes, you can put your questions in the chat, if you select everyone, that'll go to everyone. But if you want to direct it directly to Anne, you could select Anne's name or all panelists.
So I do have one question here. Somebody said they were contacted by a company that sells a tool that they say can be added to our site to make it compliant. Do you know about these and are they any good? I'm so glad you asked this question. These are what are known as overlays. The technology that claims to improve accessibility. They're a third-party tool that they basically inject code into your site. Um, they claim that they're going to make you fully compliant. Full compliance cannot be achieved with an overlay. And in fact, well, the short answer is overlays are bad. They not only won't fix all your problems, they often also introduce new accessibility problems. They're changing your code. They interfere with other technology that a disabled person might have to use. They disrupt other websites. And usually what happens is that people with actual disabilities end up having to disable any overlays that you add. So you're not helping people with disabilities, you're making it worse. The other thing is that there are a lot of concerns with data privacy with these tools. Um, there's a accessibility expert named Adrian Roselli who's worth looking up, and he's written a lot about overlays, including an article called "Overlays Will Get You Sued." So hopefully that gives you a sense. So what these companies do is, I'm not going to name any of them specifically, but if you've been contacted, you probably already know the name of at least one. But there are a lot of them out there, and sometimes they're even whitelisted versions of bad overlay companies that have already been talked about a lot. So they just basically change the name. Um, and they tend to capitalize on the fact that people don't understand accessibility. So they come along and they say, we've noticed your site is not accessible. Do you know you're going to get sued? We can help you with that by buying our product. So please stay away from overlays if you can.
And we'll give you another minute if you want to submit your questions. Some people did ask me about the slides. Just so you know, this afternoon I will follow up with the recording of this webinar and the slides. And while I give you one more minute to type your questions in, I just want to say a big thank you to Anne for sharing her expertise with us today. And another big thank you to Reason One for sponsoring today's program. Just so you know, once this closes or once you close out the screen, there will be a short survey that will launch in your web browser. Please take a minute to complete that, as we do appreciate your feedback. And any other questions coming into you?
Somebody's asking about screen readers. I can tell you a little bit more about screen readers because, as I mentioned before, they are um, many of them. There's third-party sites that are often used by people with who are blind and visually impaired. There's a one called JAWS that a lot of people may have heard of. There's another very good free one called NVDA. But your operating systems also have um, built-in screen readers, and including on your cell phones. So what these do is that they read out content linearly. So even how you build your site is important because what somebody is going to hear is just linearly the code top to bottom. Um, power users will um, be able to use shortcuts to jump. So they will jump through headers, for example, to get to parts of the page. They will jump through and use shortcuts to jump through your links and your buttons. So it's important that you write things like links and buttons in a clear way. You don't just say, "Hey, never use click here." Um, but don't have a page that is read more, read more, read more, read more. You want to be specific. Let them know in the actual label where that link is taking them. So read more about blah blah blah. Um, so there's a lot that I could talk about just related to screen readers. But you can practice on your own. Particularly, it's kind of cool. It's fun to play around with cell phones, for example. But if you do, for example, on an iPhone, first thing you want to do is make sure you know how to turn the accessibility feature off, on and off, before you get trapped in it. Um, for Somebody was asking, well, how do you do it on a cell phone because you don't have a keyboard? What a screen reader user does on a cell phone is they literally just run their finger down the screen and it announces. And I don't know if I can demonstrate it right now, but they're all the features. If you look at your settings um, in your cell phone, you'll see a section called accessibility, and there's a whole ton of accessibility features. On iPhone, the screen reader gets called VoiceOver, but you also have Zoom that you can turn on and off. You have spoken content, motion detective, you can turn off excessive motion, audio descriptions you can turn on. So it's pretty cool, all the accessibility features that all of your operating systems already have. So it's a matter of um, building your digital properties for those things. But screen reader is really important. And you hear a lot about screen readers because it's all about your content, and that you like listening to how your content comes across for many of your users. So I don't know if there are any other questions.
And none in the chat. Any other ones sent to you?
Nope, those were just the two ones.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Ann, and thank you again, Reason One. Like I said, a recording and the slides will be shared later this afternoon. And that concludes today's presentation. Thank you all, and I wish you all a great afternoon ahead.
Thanks very much. Bye.